Imagine a sweltering summer day. A small cottage house surrounded by trees, encircled by farmland as far as you can see. In that bucolic setting, a man works on what will become another of his global bestsellers. In his writing, he creates a universe powered up by profound humanist philosophy. He paints vivid pictures of peasant life, rooting for the oppressed. He's laser-focused on social justice, condemning the cruelty and exploitation of regular people, the same kind that surrounds him on this very farm. And this new novel, criticizing any wars and placing hope in the inherent goodness of humanity, will definitely fascinate people around the world for generations to come. Now suddenly the writer is interrupted by the estate manager. He came complaining to his boss, who is not only a writer but also a colonial landlord. The farm is massive, 20% larger than the size of Manhattan, but after this land was stolen from local indigenous people, environmental ruin sets in. Ancient knowledge about how to nurture it is lost, and new settler colonists make things only worse. The ginormous farm, bought from the advance on the very same book that the writer is trying to finish, is bleeding money. The writer/colonial landlord is frustrated. In his fantasies, he was bringing progress to these primitive lands, offering peasant settler colonists a better life by leasing the farm and introducing to civilization naive indigenous people, innocent children of nature who need protection. So why doesn't it work? The time is late 19th century, the place is the land of the Bashkort people stolen by Russia, and the writer/colonial landlord is Leo Tolstoy. Hey there, I'm Maksym Eristavi, a Ukrainian journalist and author of the award-winning Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. In it, I list 48 Russian invasions of the neighbors in the last 111 years alone. Despite targeting very different and distant communities, Russians would follow the same formula, and Russian civilizational greatness was an integral part of the excuse to colonize. The story I share at the beginning comes from the works of Dr. Edyta Bojanowska, an award-winning writer and thinker of Polish descent and professor at Yale University. She's master at exposing how Russian imperial culture found clever ways to justify its empire as non-imperialistic and its colonization as non-colonial. But she's not the only voice doing that. Let me introduce two others in this episode, where we will tackle the myth of Russian cultural supremacy and how it enables Russian colonialism. This is Matryoshka of Lies, the Supremacy episode.
Well, I will be cynical to begin with and will say that it is in nobody's interest for Russia to be presented as a colonial country, because Western powers that were colonialists to boot don't want really break up their good relationship with Russia. You know, economically, it's very advantageous for Germany, for instance, to be friends with Russia. And other countries that were colonialists in the past, such as Great Britain, simply are not interested. It's not in Great Britain's interest to develop some kind of vision of Russia as a last colonial empire. So that's one reason.
This is Ewa Thompson, a professor at Rice University. She's also a best-selling author in Ukraine at the moment. In almost any local bookstore, you can find her work called Imperial Knowledge. This book explains how Russia weaponized its literature to build its empire, but it was first published back in 2000 and faced lots of establishment pushback in the West. During my book shows abroad, there's always questioned with a concern for Russian great culture. Many foreigners experience cognitive dissonance. They witness horrific crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine and elsewhere, and at the same time, most of them were brought up thinking that Russian culture is cool, mysterious, nonconformist. So how can a colonial power create something like that? Dr. Thompson says that Russia worked tirelessly for centuries to implant this cognitive dissonance in foreign minds.
The Russians have anticipated this problem And they have frequently bribed Western intellectuals and Western people of Western celebrities, I would say. And these people actually very consciously, for money, wrote things that sort of blurred this image of Russia as a colonial empire and presented an image of Russia as a civilized country and wonderful country that is civilizing countries around it. And I'm thinking now of Voltaire, who is still very much admired by intellectuals in all over the world. Voltaire was paid by Catherine the Great to write pamphlets against Poland at the time when Poland was being partitioned by Russia, among others, and Prussia. So, this was a good example of how you can spend money in order to build up an image of your country that is not correct.
Another thing that Russia propaganda exploits to confuse foreigners about its imperial nature is the very definition of colonialism, which can be ambiguous and too centered on Western experience.
This anti-colonial drive and anti-colonial writings were strengthened by scholars from India and Pakistan, who are adamantly opposed to the idea that there is such a thing as white-on-white colonialism. And they simply don't want to admit it. And that's a factor too. So you have lots of factors that work against recognizing that Russia still is and has been a colonial empire.
Why do you think, once again, when it comes to Russia, we still are in these discussions abroad, that there is a separate Great Russian culture, and whatever is happening now in Ukraine with ongoing genocide has nothing to do with it?
Well, I think that we cannot look at things in isolation from each other. Russian aggressiveness is built into Russian culture. It doesn't mean that the writers themselves consciously do it, but this is the atmosphere that prevails in their works. If you take any great Russian writer, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Pushkin, Lermontov, you can closely read their works, and you will find out that those great authors take for granted all kinds of actions that, if you presented them in a different context, would be considered aggressive, hostile to other nations, destructive of other nations, and that nobody actually in Russia ever noticed that or wanted to notice that. And even abroad, it was only noted recently, within the last generation or so. So the imperialism is built into Russian culture. You cannot avoid it.
Stealing your memories, rewriting your history is important for any colonizer, wherever you look. They need to ensure that you accept the notion that they have the right to dominate you, to save you from your barbaric self. Throughout history, Russian colonizers were obsessively doing the same. You probably heard that unhinged history lecture Russian ruler Putin delivered to one of the American news personalities in early 2024.
So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these documents.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years ago.
Still.
But rewriting history is much harder for Russian colonizers to do because, well, wait, I know a much better person to explain you why.
The best answer to this question was given by Nikolai Sluchevsky, the American descendant of Pyotr Stolypin, the Prime Minister of the Russian Empire. When asked in the interview to the, I think, Russian Voice of America back in 2022, the same question, he replied in a very simple and elegant way. He said, Ukraine does have a history of its own, and Russia does not.
This is Oksana Zabuzhko, the most famous Ukrainian writer and probably the most recognizable Ukrainian abroad after President Zelensky.
what is now known as Russian history and what is generously served by Mr. Putin to Tucker Carlson and all the other gullible Westerners as the one and only version of the sacred history of Mother Russia, millennium-old history, and so on and so forth. Well, it's all been written in 1674 in Kiev by one of our Baroque thinkers of the time, Innocentii Hizel. And on the whole, Russian Empire appeared as a brainchild of Kiev intellectuals who had been working for nearly a century on the concept of an Orthodox empire.
Dr. Zabuzhko highlights a still little-known fact abroad that the mythology excusing Russian civilizational mission was actually written by Ukrainian intellectuals in the 17th century, after Russia colonized Ukraine for the first time.
So if you really read through the true history of Russian Empire, well, then you see this Ukrainian trace appearing, say, behind the reforms of Peter the Great.
A relatively young state was in desperate need of a PR story to represent itself ancient and excuse imperial expansion. Newly conquered Ukrainians helped to shape this myth of Russian civilizational superiority. Ukrainians like Feofan Prokofpovich and Alexander Bezborodko, for example.
We Ukrainians, or the Little Russians, as we were calling ourselves back then, we were on a mission to the north to bring their education, culture, church reform, books. When the University of Moscow was opened in the late 18th century, not only professors, but most of the students came from Kiev, from Kiev Mohyla Academy, the oldest Eastern European school of university of the time. It's been Ukrainization of the Moscow Tsardom, and that was its European face that our forefathers gave it. So without the proper vision of these beginnings of the Russian Empire, Russian studies never ever will be decolonized.
So why, you might ask, have I never heard anything about any of this? Maybe because for generations Russia has been explained exclusively by Russians or Westerners. Maybe because every conversation abroad about Russia and its former colonies is still hypnotized by the myth of Russian civilizational supremacy. Maybe because voices like of Thompson, Boyanovska or Zabuzhko have not been enjoying as much global spotlight as they deserve. When we talk with Dr. Thompson, this is all I can think about.
Looking back on the times when you started this work and when you started this journey that led for you to today to become this such an important voice, do you see the progress, or how do you feel looking back, whether we made enough progress or whether it goes right direction of becoming this issue becoming more aware and people seeing Russia for what it truly is, an empire, colonial empire?
Well, there's a lot of work to be done because, generations and generations of presenting Russia as an innocent country that civilized its acquisitions, its colonial acquisitions. This is something that cannot be undone within one generation. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And yes, I think that 20 years ago when I wrote this book, there was absolutely no sympathy towards my point of view in American in American scholarship. In fact, I suffered greatly because of that. It wasn't so easy to be against the entire profession. But I think that right now, if this book were published for the first time right now, I think the reception would have been quite different.
So how do we break this gaze of Russian civilizational supremacy? Where do we even start? Oksana Zabuzhko tells me Ukraine must take the lead in reshaping Russian studies.
Who else, if not us? Who else knows Russia better than us? After all, it's been Ukrainians who, along with the Germans, should be duly regarded as the founding fathers of the Russian Empire. I can fully agree with Sergei Plokhy, Harvard historian, the author of the famous The Gate of Europe, among other books, who said it's now high time that Ukrainians write a new history for Russia.
So from upset Tolstoy in 19th century, wondering why his colonial farm on stolen Bashkort land does not turn out to be a thriving paradise for locals, to Russian invaders rolling with their tanks into my ancestral village in southern Ukraine in 2022 and getting upset because nobody greets them with flowers and people block their entrance with their bodies screaming "Go home" in perfect Russian. A military occupation or land grab does not make an invasion colonial, but the ideology making the invaders believe that they have the right to do it does. And that kind of ideology does not appear detached from culture. It is the culture. So coming back to those foreign guests at my book shows concerned for great Russian culture and whether they should stop reading Tolstoy and other troubadours of Russian greatness, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I do encourage you to ask yourself why the word great is in that phrase, how it ended up there, and how many indigenous cultures were raised as a price for this supremacy marker. This show is written by Yev Kopyka, produced by Alina Polyakova, mixed and sound designed by Dmitro Volkovinsky and Anastasia Fedoskina, co-produced and narrated by me, Maksym Eristavi. Support the journalism of Ukrainska Pravda. Learn how at pravda.com.ua. Ukrainian voices and media face lots of censoring and gatekeeping, both online and offline. Please rate and leave comments under this podcast wherever you listen to it. It will help to break through the filters to the widest audience possible. The empire will fall.